In 1910, 7 men took a secret train to an island off the coast of Georgia. No last names were used, no records were kept. Security was absolute. These 7 men represented 1/4 of the world's wealth. And in 10 days on that island, they wrote the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System, the system that controls American banking today. The system you were taught was created to protect you. That's the lie. Let me show you what actually happened. You were taught that banks take deposits and lend them out. That's not true. You were taught that the Federal Reserve is a government institution. That's not true. You were taught that modern banking evolved naturally to serve the economy. That's not true. Every single thing you learned about banking in school was carefully constructed mythology designed to hide how the system actually works. And once you see the real history, once you understand what those 7 men created on Jekyll Island, you can't unsee it. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history that's been buried, sanitized, and repackaged as boring economics lessons that put students to sleep. The real story is about power, about control, about a small group of men who figured out how to own the money supply itself. Let me show you exactly what they did, how they did it, and why the banking system you use every day is built on a foundation of deception that's been maintained for over a century. Let me start with the biggest lie, the foundational myth they teach in every economics class. Banks take deposits from savers and lend that money to borrowers. You've heard this 1,000 times. It's in every textbook. Every teacher repeats it. And it's completely false. Banks don't lend deposits. They create money out of nothing when they make loans. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is admitted fact. The Bank of England published a paper in 2014 titled Money Creation in the Modern Economy that explicitly states banks do not act simply as intermediaries, lending out deposits that savers place with them. They create deposits out of thin air. Here's how it actually works. You walk into a bank and ask for a $1,000 mortgage. The bank doesn't go to the vault and pull out $100,000 that depositors put there. The bank types $100,000 into your account. That's it. They created money with a keyboard. New money that didn't exist 1 second ago. Now you owe them $100,000 plus interest. Money they never had. Money they created from nothing. But you have to pay it back with real money. Money you earn from actual work. So the bank created $100,000 instantly, but you have to spend 30 years working to pay back $200,000 with interest. The bank risked nothing, created nothing, just type numbers, and you give them 30 years of labor in return. This is the core deception of modern banking. And it's not an accident. It's not a natural evolution of commerce. It was deliberately designed by those 7 men in 1910. Let me show you who they were and what they created. The year is 1907. The American financial system is in crisis. Bank runs, panic, economic collapse. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, orchestrates a bailout using his own money and influence. He saves the system. But he's 70 years old. He won't be around forever. And the banking elite realize they need a permanent solution. They need a central bank. But there's a problem. Americans hate central banks. The first Bank of the United States was killed in 1811. The second bank was destroyed by Andrew Jackson in 1836. Americans understand that central banks concentrate power in the hands of financiers. They understand that central banks serve banks, not people. So any attempt to create a central bank will face massive public opposition. The solution? Create a central bank, but don't call it a central bank. Create a system that looks like government control, but is actually private control. Create legislation so complex that nobody can understand it. And do it in secret so there's no debate until it's too late to stop. That's where Jekyll Island comes in. November 1910, 7 men board a private train car in New York. Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, his private secretary, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, the largest bank in America, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust, and Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and representative of the Rothschild banking interests in Europe. These 7 men represented Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn, Loeb, and the Rothschilds, 1/4 of the world's wealth. They traveled under fake names, first names only. If anyone asked, they were going duck hunting. The destination was Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia owned by a club whose members included Morgan, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt. For 10 days, these 7 men drafted legislation to create a central banking system for the United States. No government officials, no elected representatives, no public input. Just bankers writing rules for banking. And they wrote brilliantly. They created a structure that gave them everything they wanted while appearing to be government oversight. Here's what they designed. First, call it the Federal Reserve System to make it sound like a government institution. It's not. It's a private corporation owned by member banks. The name is propaganda. Federal implies government control. Reserve implies safety and stored wealth. System sounds technical and boring, perfect camouflage. Second, create 12 regional Federal Reserve banks to make it look decentralized and distributed across the country. But the real power is concentrated in New York. The New York Fed is the only one that matters. It conducts open market operations. It holds the gold. It has permanent representation on the Federal Open Market Committee. The other 11 are window dressing. Third, establish a board of governors appointed by the president to create the appearance of government control. But the board can't create money. Only the Federal Reserve banks can do that. And those banks are owned by private banks who elect their own directors. The government appointees provide political cover. The private banks retain actual control. Fourth, give the Fed a dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment. This sounds reasonable, but it's actually genius, because these two goals often conflict. If you're fighting inflation, you raise rates and kill jobs. If you're fighting unemployment, you lower rates and create inflation. So the Fed can always justify whatever policy benefits banks by claiming they're balancing the dual mandate. Fifth, make the Fed independent. Congress can't audit it fully. The president can't fire board members except for cause. The Fed doesn't need congressional appropriations. It funds itself from the interest on bonds it holds. This independence means the Fed isn't accountable to voters. It's accountable to the banks that own it. These 5 design principles created the perfect system. Private ownership disguised as public institution. Concentrated power disguised as decentralization. Unaccountable authority disguised as independent expertise. And all of it hidden behind complexity that ensures almost nobody understands how it works. The 7 men finished their draft in 10 days. Then came the hard part, getting it passed. They knew they couldn't introduce legislation written by bankers on a private island, so they used Senator Aldrich as the front man. He introduced the Aldrich Plan in 1912. It was immediately attacked as a banker's scheme, which it was. The plan failed, but that failure was anticipated. The bankers regrouped and made a strategic pivot. They found Democrats who opposed the Aldrich Plan and convinced them to introduce their own version. The Glass-Owen bill was presented as an alternative that would prevent banker control. It was the exact same structure with minor cosmetic changes, but because it came from Democrats and was positioned as anti-Wall Street, it passed. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23rd. 1913, 2 days before Christmas when most of Congress had left Washington. Many representatives never even read the 1,000-page bill. They trusted their party leaders who told them it would prevent another 1907 panic. Wilson later admitted his mistake. He wrote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men who necessarily, by very reason of their own limitations, chill and check and destroy genuine economic freedom. Too late, the system was in place. And over the next century, that system would be used exactly as designed, to transfer wealth from the public to the banking elite through money creation and interest collection. Now let me show you how the system actually operates, because this is where the deception becomes mechanical theft. The Fed creates money out of nothing, loans it to the government by buying Treasury bonds, and collects interest on money it created for free. Let me walk through the mechanics. Step 1, the government needs money. Let's say Congress passes a budget that requires $1 trillion more than tax revenue. The Treasury Department issues $1 trillion in bonds, IOUs promising to pay back the money with interest. Step 2, the Federal Reserve buys those bonds, not with money they have, with money they create. They type $1 trillion into the Treasury's account at the Fed. New money, created from nothing. The Treasury now has $1 trillion to spend. Step 3, the Treasury spends that money into the economy. Government contracts, salaries, programs. The $1 trillion enters circulation. This is inflation, more money chasing the same goods and services. Step 4, the government pays interest on those bonds every year, forever, or until the bonds mature, interest paid to the Federal Reserve for money the Fed created for free. Where does the government get money for interest? Taxes. Your taxes. Paying interest to private banks for money they created from nothing. Step 5. The Fed returns some of that interest to the Treasury as surplus. This creates the appearance that the Fed is a government institution serving the public, but the Fed keeps enough to pay 6% dividends to the member banks that own it, plus funding its massive operations. And the real profit isn't the interest, it's the control over the money supply itself. This is the system. The government borrows money that the Fed creates from nothing. The public pays taxes to service that debt. The banks that own the Fed profit from interest payments and, more importantly, maintain control over the money supply. And everyone is taught this is normal. This is just how banking works. But it's not normal. It's theft disguised as monetary policy. Let me show you the alternative that existed before 1913. Before the Federal Reserve, the government could issue debt-free money directly. Greenbacks during the Civil War were exactly this, currency printed by the Treasury without corresponding debt. Lincoln issued $450 million in greenbacks to fund the war without borrowing from banks. The bankers hated this. Why? Because debt-free money eliminates their control. If the government can issue currency directly, banks can't profit from lending money they created from nothing. The system that enriched the banking elite for centuries would collapse. So the bankers fought back, they lobbied, they funded opposition, they created economic crises to demonstrate the dangers of government-issued currency, and eventually they won. The Federal Reserve Act killed the government's ability to issue debt-free money. Now all money comes with debt attached. Debt to the Fed, interest paid forever. This is the real history of banking, not the sanitized story in textbooks, not the narrative about intermediation and capital allocation. The real story is about power, about a small group of men who figured out how to own the money itself. And the system they created in 1910 on Jekyll Island is still operating today. But the deception goes deeper, because the Federal Reserve is just the American version of a global system. The Bank of England was created the same way in 1694. Private bankers funding the government in exchange for a monopoly on money creation. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the International Monetary Fund, all of them operate on the same principle. Private control disguised as public institution. This global banking system is coordinated through the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. The BIS is the central bank for central banks. It's where the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, all of them coordinate policy. The BIS is completely immune from national laws. It can't be audited. It can't be taxed. It's the ultimate expression of banking power operating above governments. And this is what you weren't taught in school. You were taught about supply and demand, about fractional reserve banking, about the Fed adjusting interest rates to manage the economy. All true, but irrelevant to the core function. The core function is control. Control over money creation, control over credit, control over the economy itself. Now here's where this gets personal. Here's how this system affects you directly. Every dollar in your wallet is debt-based money. It was created when someone, the government, a corporation, an individual, borrowed it into existence. And that means the money supply must constantly grow to service existing debt. If the money supply doesn't grow, if banks stop lending, if the Fed stops creating money, the system collapses. Because there's never enough money in circulation to pay back all the debt plus interest. The interest doesn't exist yet. It has to be borrowed into existence by someone else. This is why the system requires constant inflation. Why the Fed targets 2% inflation annually. Not because inflation is good for you, it destroys your purchasing power. But because without constant money creation, the debt-based system collapses. The people who own the system need inflation to keep it running. And this is why you work harder every year but feel poorer. Your wages might increase 2%, but real inflation, food, housing, energy, healthcare, runs 5% to 10%. You're losing ground. But the bankers who created the money you're earning, they're collecting interest on money they created for free. They're getting richer while you're getting poor. And it's all built into the system designed at Jekyll Island. Let me show you the numbers. In 1913, when the Fed was created, total U.S. debt was $2.9 billion. Today, it's over $36 trillion. That's a 12,000-fold increase. Where did that money come from? The Fed created it. And who profits from $36 trillion in debt? The banks that own the Fed. They collect interest on money they created from nothing. Your share of the national debt is $107,000 per citizen. You didn't borrow this money. The government borrowed it, but you're responsible for paying it back through taxes. You're working to pay interest on money created by private banks who took no risk and provided nothing of value except typing numbers into computers. This is the theft. This is the system. And this is what you weren't supposed to figure out. They keep you distracted with political theater. Left versus right, Democrat versus Republican. Meanwhile, both parties borrow from the Fed. Both parties expand the debt. Both parties serve the banking system that owns them. Now, here's what happened when leaders tried to change the system. When they tried to break the bank's monopoly on money creation, Lincoln issued greenbacks, debt-free currency. He was assassinated in 1865. John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 11110 in 1963, authorizing the Treasury to issue silver certificates, debt-free currency backed by silver. He was assassinated 5 months later. The order was never implemented. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency to replace the dollar in international trade. Libya was destroyed in 2011. Saddam Hussein started selling Iraqi oil in euros instead of dollars in 2000. Iraq was invaded in 2003. These aren't coincidences. These are consequences. The banking system protects itself, violently if necessary. Countries that maintain sovereignty over their own currencies, that refuse to participate in the debt-based dollar system, face sanctions, coups, or military intervention. Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, what do they have in common? Central banks not connected to the BIS system. Currencies not dependent on dollar-denominated debt, and constant pressure from Western powers to force them into compliance. This is the global banking empire, not built with armies, though armies enforce it when necessary, built with debt, with central banks, with a system designed at Jekyll Island in 1910 that has been replicated worldwide. A system that transfers wealth from workers to bankers through money creation, interest collection, and inflation. So what do you do with this information? Most people do nothing. They're too invested in the system. They have mortgages, credit cards, car loans, all debt created from nothing that they're spending their lives paying back. They can't afford to question the system because they're trapped in it. But understanding the system gives you advantages. First, minimize debt. Every dollar you borrow is created from nothing and must be paid back with real labor. The less debt you have, the less you're enriching the system. Pay off high-interest debt first. Mortgages last because the interest is tax-deductible and inflation works in your favor on fixed-rate debt. Second, hold hard assets. Gold, silver, real estate, Bitcoin. Assets that can't be created from nothing. Assets that maintain value when fiat currency inflates. The banks want you holding dollars, depreciating currency they control. Hold assets they can't print. Third, understand that inflation is theft. The Fed targets 2% inflation. That's a 2% annual transfer of your wealth to the banking system. Over 30 years, 2% compounds to 45% loss of purchasing power. Your savings are being stolen slowly through inflation. Protect yourself by holding assets that appreciate faster than inflation. Fourth, recognize that the system will eventually collapse. All debt-based systems collapse. Rome, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The math doesn't work. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. You can't service exponential debt with linear economic growth. At some point, the system resets, either through hyperinflation that destroys the currency or through default that destroys the debt. When that reset comes, and it will come, the people holding dollars will be wiped out. The people holding hard assets will survive. The banks will get bailed out because they own the government. You won't. Position accordingly. Here's the bottom line. Everything you were taught about banking is a lie. Banks don't lend deposits. They create money from nothing. The Federal Reserve isn't a government institution. It's a private corporation owned by banks. The system wasn't designed to serve the economy. It was designed to extract wealth from the public and transfer it to the banking elite. The system was created by 7 men on Jekyll Island in 1910. They wrote legislation in secret to give themselves control over the money supply. They disguised private ownership as public institution. They created complexity to prevent understanding. And they've maintained the system for over a century through political capture, propaganda, and when necessary, violence. You weren't supposed to know this. They teach sanitized mythology in schools because the truth is too damaging. The truth reveals that the entire financial system is a scam, that your life of labor is spent servicing debt created from nothing, that the banks are stealing your wealth through inflation and interest while contributing nothing of value. But now you know. The question is what you do with that knowledge. Most people will ignore it. They'll go back to their mortgages and credit cards and retirement accounts invested in stocks of companies that are themselves drowning in debt. They'll keep playing the game because they don't know how to exit. But a small group will see the pattern. They'll minimize debt. They'll accumulate hard assets. They'll prepare for the inevitable reset. And when the system collapses, when the debt becomes unsustainable and the currency devalues, they'll survive while everyone else is destroyed. The 7 men who met at Jekyll Island understood something fundamental. Control the money, and you control everything. They built a system to achieve that control. That system is still operating today. It's stealing your wealth right now through inflation, interest, and taxation. The lie you were taught protects the system. The truth threatens it. Now you know the truth. Position yourself accordingly. If this video showed you how the banking system really works, if you understand now that everything you learned in school was propaganda designed to hide theft, subscribe to Treasury Tales, because I'll keep showing you how the system operates, how it extracts wealth, how it protects itself, and how you can protect yourself from it. This is not financial advice. This is historical truth. 7 men. 1 island, 10 days. They designed the system that controls your life. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, built on lies, operating through deception, stealing wealth for over a century. You weren't supposed to know. Now you do.